The morning sun poured over the airbase, painting the runway in golden light as soldiers hurried to board the transport plane. Among them was a young woman in a plain flight jacket, carrying a small duffel bag and keeping to herself. To anyone watching, she looked like a support staff member, or maybe a low-ranking soldier catching a ride. No one noticed the calm authority in her eyes or the quiet confidence in her steps as she approached the aircraft. The pilot, a tall man with mirrored sunglasses and a quick temper, frowned when he saw her. "Ma'am, this flight's for active personnel only," he barked, waving her away. She stopped, surprised but composed, and tried to explain she had clearance. The pilot cut her off before she could finish. "We're not taking passengers today. Go back and check with logistics." Round them, a few soldiers chuckled quietly, whispering about how strict their pilot could be. The woman didn't argue. She simply stood there, her expression unreadable, before stepping aside. Her silence made the moment even more uncomfortable. The pilot turned back toward the plane, shaking his head, muttering about untrained staff showing up in the wrong place. But something about her presence lingered. The co-pilot, who had been reviewing the manifest, froze when he spotted a name highlighted in red. He looked up, glancing nervously toward the woman now waiting near the hangar door. "Ah, sir," he said softly. "You might want to see this." The pilot's brows furrowed as he took the clipboard and the color. Drained from his face, the name beside the clearance code wasn't just another passenger. It was Colonel, a Navy SEAL officer with years of classified missions under her command. The woman he had just kicked off the flight wasn't staff. She was one of the most decorated special operations leaders in the force. He turned sharply, eyes wide, but she was already walking away down the tarmac, her jacket fluttering in the wind. The soldiers nearby had fallen silent, realizing what had just happened. The pilot took a slow step forward, regret written all over his face. He had just made a mistake that could cost him his career, and he didn't even know how bad it was going to get. Back at the hangar, whispers spread fast. No one could believe what had just happened. Some soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, others pretended not to notice. The pilot paced near the plane, trying to make sense of it. He wasn't a bad man, just someone used to being in control. But this mistake felt different. It wasn't just an awkward misunderstanding. He had unknowingly disrespected someone who outranked him by miles. Meanwhile, the woman walked quietly toward the command office. Her name was Colonel Sarah Blake, one of the most respected officers in the Navy SEAL program. Few people knew what she looked like because most of her missions were classified. She preferred to stay away from attention, moving through bases like a shadow. That morning, she hadn't worn her uniform for a reason. She was on a surprise inspection, meant to test how her teams handled discipline and respect. What she found instead was arrogance and assumption. Inside the base office, young lieutenant saw her enter and immediately stood at attention. "Colonel Blake, ma'am," he said, his voice trembling slightly. She gave a quiet nod. "I'll be observing Flight Bravo," she said. "Make sure the crew is ready." The lieutenant nodded quickly, realizing the crew on that flight included the same pilot who had just turned her away. Out on the runway, the pilot finally got the order to prepare for takeoff again. But before he could relax, a voice came through his headset. "Colonel Blake will be joining you on this flight." His heart sank. He glanced at his crew. They looked just as stunned as she stepped back onto the plane. Silence fell. The same soldiers who had laughed earlier now stood rigid, avoiding her gaze. The pilot swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. He had no idea what she planned to do or how she would respond once they were in the air. The engines roared to life as the team prepared for takeoff. Colonel Sarah Blake took her seat quietly near the back, her expression calm but unreadable. The pilot, Captain Reed, kept glancing at her through the cockpit window, his hands tightening on the controls. Every soldier on board could feel the tension in the air. The same woman they thought was a random staff member now sat behind them, decorated. CAL officer with a reputation for sharp judgment and an even sharper sense of discipline. No one dared to speak. The laughter from earlier had vanished, replaced by nervous silence. The only sound was the steady hum of the aircraft as it lifted off the runway. Reed's co-pilot, Jenkins, whispered under his breath, "You think she's going to report this?" Reed didn't answer. His jaw clenched as he replayed the moment on the tarmac over and over again. How could he have missed the signs? Her posture, her calm tone, everything about her screamed authority. Yet he hadn't looked past the surface. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed lost in thought. She watched the clouds drift by the window, her mind already processing the events. Over the years, she had faced tougher situations, combat missions, rescue operations, and split-second life-or-death choices. But what disappointed her most wasn't the pilot's anger. It was the lack of respect. Leadership wasn't about shouting orders. It was about character. Something she had spent her entire career trying to teach. Halfway through the flight, Reed's headset crackled with a message from Base Command. "Colonel Blake will be evaluating your team today. Full operational readiness." His stomach dropped. This wasn't just a flight anymore, it was a test. One mistake could change everything. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of his choices settle on him. The real mission had just begun. No one knew what would happen next. The flight climbed higher, cutting through a layer of thick clouds as the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Everyone stayed silent, glancing occasionally toward Colonel Blake. Her calm composure made the tension even worse. Captain Reed tried to focus on his instruments, but his hands were damp with sweat. Every small sound felt louder, the click of a buckle, the shift of a boot, the rustle of her jacket as she moved slightly in her seat. An hour into the mission, the radio crackled again. "Flight Bravo, change of route. New coordinates incoming. You'll be making a supply drop in hostile terrain." Reed frowned. This wasn't in the plan. He looked back toward Blake, who was already studying the map on her tablet. "Problem, Captain?" she asked evenly. Her tone wasn't harsh, but it carried a weight that made him sit straighter. "No, ma'am," he replied quickly, adjusting the controls as the helicopter veered off course. Turbulence hit hard. The aircraft jolted, throwing a few soldiers off balance. One shouted something over the roar of the engine, but Blake didn't move. She stayed perfectly still, her eyes locked on the horizon as if she'd been through this 1,000 times before. Reed stole a quick glance at her through the rearview mirror. For the first time, he noticed the scars on her hands, the kind only years of field work could leave. Moments later, the warning light blinked red. Fuel levels dropping faster than expected. Jenkins muttered. Reed cursed under his breath. A sandstorm was forming below, and visibility was worsening fast. They had limited fuel, an altered route, and now a storm closing in. Blake stood up slowly, walking toward the cockpit. The crew's eyes followed her every step. "Captain," she said, voice calm but firm, "if you keep this heading, we'll lose control." Reed hesitated, his pride clashing with fear. The storm clouds flashed ahead, thunder shaking the cabin. She leaned closer, her voice steady even through the chaos. "You need to trust me." The next few seconds would decide everything, and this time, there was no room for another mistake. The helicopter shook violently as thunder rolled across the sky. Red lights flashed across the control panel, and alarms screamed in the cockpit. Captain Reed fought to keep the aircraft steady, sweat dripping down his neck. The storm was swallowing them whole. And those approaching signals were getting closer, too close. Colonel Blake moved to the front, steady and composed despite the chaos. "Cut power to the transponder," she ordered again. "They're locking onto our signal." Reed hesitated, torn between his training and her command. Then, realizing there was no time left, he flipped the switch. The radar screen went black, and for a moment, the cabin fell silent, except for the roar of the wind. Suddenly, a blinding flash illuminated the clouds. One of the unknown craft streaked past them, shaking the entire helicopter. The soldiers braced themselves, clutching the rails as the aircraft dipped sharply. "We've got to lose them," Jenkins yelled. Reed gritted his teeth, pulling hard on the control stick. "Hold on." Blake leaned over the console, pointing toward a dark mountain ridge ahead. "They'll take us through that canyon. It'll block their scanners." Reed shot her a doubtful glance, but followed her lead. The helicopter plunged lower, wind whipping through the open hatch as lightning flashed above. They sped into the narrow canyon, the sound of rushing air echoing off the walls. The pursuing craft tried to follow, but the storm was too fierce. One by one, the signals on the radar disappeared. Reed exhaled, trembling from adrenaline. "We're clear, I think." Blake gave a faint nod, her eyes still scanning the skies. "You handled that well, Captain," she said calmly. "Even after you kicked me off your plane." He turned toward her, guilt flashing across his face. "Ma'am, I didn't know." Before he could finish, her radio crackled to life again. A voice from command broke through the static. "Colonel Blake, mission successful. Drone interception confirmed. The pilot passed your evaluation." Reed blinked. "Evaluation." She smiled faintly, fastening her harness. "I told you, Captain." This was a test. As the helicopter steadied above the clouds, Reed realized the truth. She hadn't just been testing the crew's skill. She had been testing their character. And he had barely made it through. The storm began to fade as the helicopter cleared the ridge, the sun breaking through the clouds in soft golden light. Everyone let out the breath they didn't realize they were holding. Captain Reed steadied the aircraft, still shaken but relieved. Colonel Blake sat quietly, eyes fixed on the horizon, her calmness returning as if nothing had happened. For a moment, it felt like the danger had passed, but then the radar flickered back to life. One last signal remained. Jenkins leaned forward. "Ma'am, it's still following us." Reed's pulse spiked. "How is that possible?" "We cut the beacon." Blake didn't answer immediately. She studied the monitor, her expression tightening. "Because it's not tracking the helicopter," she said slowly. "It's tracking me." The crew froze. Reed turned toward her, confused. "You?" She nodded. "My mission tracker, it's embedded in my tactical badge. It broadcasts my location during classified operations. That's how they found us." Without hesitation, she unpinned the badge and set it on the console. "Open the rear hatch." Reed hesitated. "You can't just throw that out midair." But she was already moving toward the back of the cabin, wind rushing in as the door opened. She tossed the badge into the storm clouds below, watching as it disappeared into the haze. Seconds later, the final signal vanished from the radar. Silence filled the cockpit. Reed finally spoke, his voice low. "You just risked your identification. That tracker links you to command." Blake turned to him with a small smile. "Sometimes, Captain, you have to lose a signal to stay alive." He looked at her with newfound respect. Everything about her calm under pressure, her quick thinking, her quiet authority suddenly made sense. But before he could say another word, his radio lit up again with an encrypted transmission. "Captain Reed, this is command. Prepare for immediate extraction." Colonel Blake's tracker wasn't the only one transmitting. Reed froze, realizing what that meant. Somewhere inside the helicopter, another signal was active, one no one had planted. Blake's eyes narrowed. "We're not alone," she said quietly. Scanning the cabin, the storm might have ended outside, but inside that helicopter, a new danger had just begun. Reed's heart pounded as the message echoed through the headset. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, while Colonel Blake calmly scanned the cabin. Her sharp eyes landed on a small device tucked behind one of the supply crates, barely visible, blinking faintly. Without hesitation, she signaled for everyone to stay back and carefully reached for it. The moment she lifted it into view, Reed recognized it a covert tracker, military grade. But not from their side. She handed it to him, her tone steady. "Looks like someone wanted to know more than just our route." Reed nodded grimly. Maybe this mission wasn't just a test after all. Blake gave a faint smile. "Every mission is a test, Captain. Some just come with more lessons." With the tracker secured, they completed their descent back to base. The One Stent's crew now sat quietly, processing everything that had happened. Reed couldn't help but glance back at the colonel, still amazed by her composure. Hours earlier, he had mistaken her for staff. Now he knew she was someone who carried the weight of leadership without ever needing to prove it. When they landed, command officers were already waiting. Blake stepped out first, her boots hitting the tarmac with quiet confidence. She turned to Reed, her expression softer now. "You handled yourself well up there," she said. "You made mistakes, but you learned. That's what matters." Reed nodded respectfully, realizing the experience had changed him more than any training ever could. As she walked away toward the briefing room, the wind caught her jacket, revealing the SEAL insignia once more. Reed watched in silence, understanding that he had just flown beside a legend and almost lost her. Because of his own assumptions, the day's chaos had ended. But the lesson lingered. True rank isn't worn on the shoulder. It's shown through courage, composure, and the strength to lead when everything is falling apart. If you enjoyed this story and want more intense thrillers and suspenseful adventures, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with friends who love a good mystery. Your support helps me bring you more stories just like this one.